On a damp morning in 1863, two Union scouts rode a sandy road through pine and palmetto and slowed at a Florida farm where smoke curled from the chimney. The gate hung open. Chickens scratched without fear, and a milk cow knocked her head against a stall, heavy and waiting. The door was ajar as if a breath had pushed it and forgot to close. Inside, the air held coffee, fat, and a faint sweet note like sugar boiled too long. On the table sat bowls of stew with skins at the edges, a loaf of cornbread cut into equal squares, and 5 tin cups that felt warm. Chairs had been pushed back an inch, turned just enough to clear chalk squares under each leg. The room looked calm, then staged, then watched. The mantel clock ticked, yet both hands pointed to 12, a held note that never ended. A child's slate rested on the sideboard. Tallies lined one edge. Beside it lay a nub of chalk and a gray smear where a word had been rubbed away. Obedience was still there. A spool of red thread lay unwound the length of an arm and cut blunt. Under the table, the wood was polished where knees had pressed, and along the underside ran small notches spaced exact as if time had been kept on bodies. The hearth ash was raked flat into a circle with ticks scratched around the rim. 5 ticks, a gap, then 5 more. The poker was clean. The back room was made like a display. The mattress was tight as a drum. Sheet corners were folded sharp. Curtains fell to the same height on both sides. On the dresser, a pocket watch ticked, lid open. Beside it lay a ribbon folded into 4 even parts. When a scout lifted it, a faint ring showed where it had sat. He set it back without knowing why. The barn held a saddled horse, damp with sweat, as if someone had ridden hard and stopped to wipe the bridle clean. The well rope was tied with tight, even knots the same space apart, a ruler made of cord. The dog did not cross the threshold. It lay on the porch and stared toward the trees. Neighbors arrived when the word reached the road. They stood in the doorway with hats held low and spoke of the Mortons in soft voices. They said the father, Elias, was steady and kind, quick to help lift a beam, careful with his words. His wife kept a fine house and never sent a guest away hungry. The children were quiet and well-behaved. Some nights, riding by, you could hear a hum from inside, not a tune but a breath made into sound. Lights were seen late when the road was dark. No one asked why. Because nothing looked wrong and the family smiled and waved. The scouts wrote that food was warm, the clock was wound, the bed was made. They noted the spoons faced east, the knives pointed the same way, and 4 equal thumb dents ran along the table edge where someone had gripped and held. They lifted a sampler and found faint straight marks on the plank behind it, like a small private code. By the window latch, paint was rubbed smooth in an oval that matched a fingertip held there often. Above the door frame, a pencil line ran across with 5 short marks beneath it, the same pattern repeated once on the pantry shelf where jars should sit. By day's end, the sun slid a pale band across the table. The stew cooled and wrinkled. The house did not creak. It held its posture and seemed to listen for a cue that never came. When the men stepped into the yard, the air felt thinner, as if the rooms behind them still watched through glass. They noted the 5 cups, the 5 ticks in ash, the 5 chalk squares, the 5 dots beneath the line, and thought of a family that rose in unison and moved as one. They did not know yet whose steady hand had trained this house to breathe in counts and to place objects on exact lines, nor whose calm smile had told a road of neighbors that order was the same as goodness. They only knew the farm was waiting now, and that the waiting felt like a lesson paused mid-sentence, ready to turn the page to the hand that wrote it. Elias Morton was remembered first for his stillness. In the town ledger, his name appeared as a donor to the church, a provider of grain during drought, a man who loaned his mule without charge when neighbors needed to plow. He was the sort who bowed his head with reverence and spoke sparingly, never letting anger show in his voice. When he smiled, it was faint but firm, like the kind of smile that reassured others they were in good company. Children were taught to wave when he passed. Women trusted him to escort them across dark stretches of road after service. Men valued his handshake, steady and dry. There was nothing in his outward life that pointed toward darkness, yet beneath that calm exterior he carried a devotion not to Scripture itself, but to a secret version he had written in his own hand. His journals, found decades later beneath loose floorboards sealed in wax, revealed a hidden study that read more like commandments. He wrote of silence, not as absence of sound, but as a substance to be measured. He described counting how long his children could remain still without twitch or breath, noting the exact second when a hand trembled or an eye watered. Each lapse was marked in ink. He believed silence had weight, that disobedience made it lighter, and obedience made it dense enough to shape flesh. He wrote that flesh must be marked so the silence would remain inside. These were not the thoughts of a distant recluse, but of the same man who knelt in prayer each Sunday, his hands folded neat, while his neighbors whispered of his discipline with admiration. The more one reads the journals, the more the writing drifts from moral notes into a private code of lessons. Elias drew grids, listing each family member's name in columns beside numbers that climbed with each passing day. Along the margins, he wrote phrases like, "The boy's voice cracked at measure 20, or "The girl's eyes resisted the flame for 30 seconds before watering." He cataloged not misbehavior but endurance, as if the human body was an instrument that could be tuned by pain and silence. He measured how long each child could kneel on beans without moving, or how long a hand could hover above fire before jerking away. To him, their resistance was not cruelty but music, a chorus of obedience that he believed he alone was chosen to conduct. He smiled at church, not from joy but because he knew no one could see the measures written at home. His smile was the mask of a man convinced that suffering, properly timed and recorded, was a form of worship. Those who knew him well recalled strange little habits in hindsight. He tapped the table after meals exactly 5 times before rising. He adjusted hymnals so they aligned in perfect stacks, and once stayed after service to scrape wax drippings until the floor shone clean. People thought of him as meticulous, the sort who sought order in chaos. No one suspected he was training his family in the same way, turning their breath, their cries, even their blood into entries for his book. Neighbors later testified that his discipline was admired, especially in wartime when children elsewhere grew unruly. His were quiet, obedient, never seen to quarrel. They stood by their father in church like soldiers at attention, eyes forward, hands folded. Some found it impressive. Others, much later, admitted it was unsettling, though no one said so aloud then. The journals revealed a man who saw virtue not in kindness, but in control. He wrote of flesh as clay to be cut and hardened, of silence as a stone to be carried until it broke the weak. He described moments of slipping his knife across bark, carving lines to mimic the marks he placed on skin, calling it scripture of obedience. His handwriting grew darker in tone as the years passed, yet always steady, always neat. He never raged on the page. He did not confess or repent. He instructed as if writing lessons for a pupil who would one day continue his work. The image of the smiling father, generous and calm, now collided with the reality of a man who bent his children to his own theology of suffering. In every handshake, in every bow of the head, in every faint smile, he carried the certainty that his discipline was righteous and unseen by those who stood only a few steps away. To live near him was to believe in his goodness because nothing on his face betrayed the truth. To read his words now is to understand how evil hid behind order, how it thrived in silence, and how it smiled when no one asked what that smile meant. The journals closed with a final note scrawled larger than the rest. "The body remembers longer than the soul, mark it well." And with that line, the image of Elias Morton, neighbor, friend, father, collapsed into something colder, something that had been waiting in plain sight. Clara Morton was remembered as a quiet girl with hair the color of dried wheat and a ribbon always tied neat against it. On her last Sunday at church, she sat beside her mother, hands folded, eyes lowered, the red ribbon in her hair catching the light of the window like a spark against the drab wood pews. Neighbors recalled that she neither fidgeted nor whispered as other children did. She was still, as if trained to be so. That ribbon, bright and simple, was the only mark of childhood she carried into a life already pressed flat by her father's discipline. When she vanished, the ribbon became her ghost, an object that outlived her presence, speaking where her voice had been silenced. Weeks later, hunters combing the woods for game stumbled upon a tree with something unnatural fixed to it. A strip of red cloth nailed flat fluttered in the damp breeze. Beneath it, at the base of the trunk, lay a circle of small bones. Birds, squirrels, creatures picked clean and arranged with unnerving care. The bones were not scattered as animals might leave them, but placed in concentric rings, ribs aligned, skulls tilted toward the center. The earth inside the circle had been raked smooth, and in the soil were faint impressions of knees pressed down for long minutes. The men stood back in silence, sensing that the clearing had been used not for play but for ritual. They recognized the ribbon. It was Clara's. And in that moment, the woods themselves seemed to whisper what her father had written in his hidden pages. That obedience was measured, and silence had to be marked in flesh. The discovery spread quickly. Neighbors spoke of the Mortons in lowered voices, piecing together fragments they had ignored before. They remembered how Elias demanded his children bow their heads longer than the rest, how Clara's small frame stood locked in posture while others shifted. They thought of the quiet that surrounded the farm even in summer when laughter should have carried across the fields. Now the ribbon nailed to the tree told them what they had refused to see. That Clara's silence had been rehearsed, her stillness cultivated like a crop, her obedience bound into her body until it left a trace even in the wilderness. Children in the village began to fear the woods. They whispered that if you strayed too far, you could hear humming, low and without tune, circling through the pines. Some said they saw ribbons tied to branches, strips of cloth marking paths that led nowhere. Dogs balked at certain clearings, ears low, refusing to step inside. The ribbon had turned the forest into an extension of the Morton farm, carrying Elias's lessons beyond the walls of his house into the soil itself. What had been private ritual inside the cellar now seemed etched into the land, a shadow lesson that even trees and animals had been forced to bear. Clara herself was never found. Only the ribbon and the bones remained, silent testimony to the order her father imposed. The object meant for beauty, a child's simple adornment, had been driven through with a nail and made into a marker of something far darker. The neighbors kept the story quiet, fearful of what it implied, but the woods carried it anyway. Every hunter who passed that clearing said it felt as though eyes were on him, patient, waiting. And the longer one stared at the nailed ribbon, the more it seemed less like a remnant of a child and more like a seal, a sign that Elias Morton's lessons had no boundary, that even the forest itself had been taught to obey. Beneath the Morton kitchen, a narrow door opened onto the root cellar where potatoes should have slept cool in baskets and jars of pickled beans should have lined the shelves. When neighbors stepped down during the first searches, their lanterns caught the shine of iron fixed into beams overhead. The hooks were too thick for sacks of onions, too widely spaced for simple storage. They hung like waiting hands, each turned the same direction, each worn smooth at the curve. The air smelled not only of earth but of metal, a tang that clung to the back of the throat. In one corner, half hidden beneath a layer of dust, lay a wooden slate no larger than a hymn book. It bore names scratched with a hand that pressed hard into the grain: Clara, Samuel, Ruth, Elias Jr., and one more, a cousin who had once lived with them for a season. Each name was scored through with a sharp X, as though marked complete. The chalk still clung white in the grooves, the final strike across the last name fresher than the rest. Whoever had written it had treated children as items in a ledger, their lives crossed off like tasks. The cellar walls showed more than storage. Faint lines had been etched into the packed earth, circles overlapping, each measured with care. Some marks were small as coins, others wide enough for a body to kneel within. The neighbors whispered that Elias had held his lessons here, where silence and obedience could be tested without witness. A few swore the hooks were spaced exactly as a man's outstretched arms, a symmetry that spoke not of accident, but of design. Standing in that cellar, the house above felt heavier, as though the beams themselves had been soaked with what had happened beneath them. The room did not feel abandoned so much as paused, a stage waiting for the next act. When the lanterns flickered against the slate of crossed-out names, the neighbors turned away quickly, unwilling to admit the thought that pressed on all of them, that the Morton children had not only lived under discipline but had been measured, marked, and erased in order one by one. The cellar had not stayed empty. It had remembered, and in its silence, it seemed still to be waiting for another name to be written. Samuel Morton was only 9, a small boy with a voice that carried softer than wind through grass. In church, he had once been asked to join the hymn, and his tone was pure enough that even elders nodded with quiet approval. For most children, such a gift might have been cherished, but for Samuel it became the weight his father pressed hardest upon. Elias Morton, obsessed with control, turned his son's song into another instrument for discipline. He made the boy stand in the kitchen after supper and hold a single note for as long as his breath allowed. When Samuel faltered, he was told to begin again, longer, steadier, until his throat ached raw. Sometimes neighbors walking past at dusk claimed they heard the drawn-out wail of a note that broke and started again, stretched past the edge of comfort into something more like punishment. Elias wrote in his journal that this was discipline of the lungs, a way to bind obedience to the body itself. The boy's voice weakened as weeks passed. What had been music became strained sound, the edges fraying until specks of blood appeared on the cloth he pressed to his lips. Still Elias smiled in public, spoke kindly of his son, and let no shadow of cruelty cross his face. Neighbors only noticed the boy's lowered eyes, the way his small shoulders curved inward, and the faint bruising along his neck that seemed too symmetrical to come from play. A neighbor boy remembered Samuel once stepping behind the barn and whispering that he no longer wanted to sing, that his voice hurt and would not stop hurting. But no one carried the whisper further. No one confronted the father who smiled so calmly, who shook hands so firmly after church. Silence was easier than doubt. The final weeks before the disappearance left Samuel thin and voiceless. He no longer sang at service, and when hymns rose, he only mouthed the words, afraid his father's gaze might linger if he refused. At home, the discipline continued. Elias marked seconds in a book, counting how long the note was held, writing numbers beside the boy's name. To him, Samuel was not a son but a vessel for measurement, a body to prove that silence and control could be etched into flesh. By the time the family vanished, Samuel's voice had nearly vanished with them. The boy who once sang soft enough to quiet a room had been turned into silence itself. And when neighbors later pieced together what they had overlooked, they realized that the smile Elias carried among them had hidden a truth they all chose not to see. that a child's song had been bent into obedience until it bled. The Morton home was spoken of as a place of generosity, a house where the table was always set wide enough for neighbors passing through. Guests recalled the smell of stewed vegetables and cornbread rising from the oven, the soft lamplight that made the wood walls glow, and Elias himself greeting visitors with that faint, composed smile that never faltered. To walk into the Morton dining room was to feel welcome, yet beneath the welcome lay rules that no one openly questioned. Food was served in equal portions, each dish measured with care. No one, not even children, was allowed to leave a scrap on the plate. The prayer before eating stretched long, a silence so heavy that guests found themselves holding their breath, waiting for the cue to lift forks. When the amen was spoken, all heads lowered once more, not to mutter words, but to hold stillness, as though silence itself was part of the meal. At first, visitors thought this a quaint tradition, a strictness that spoke of discipline rather than strangeness. But some recalled later that they felt watched during those meals, as if their movements were measured, as if the sound of a spoon striking a bowl too sharply brought a flicker of disapproval in Elias's eyes. His children obeyed without hesitation. They chewed slowly, swallowed without complaint, and never looked away from their plates. Guests admired their manners, saying afterward that the Mortons had raised their family well. Yet beneath admiration, there had been unease. A neighbor's wife later admitted she once set her fork down early and felt the air tighten, the whole room waiting until she lifted it again. What lingered most were the sounds. After the prayer and the first bites, the house grew so quiet that the smallest creak seemed loud. Several guests swore they heard faint thuds from beneath the floor, muffled, rhythmic, like something shifting in the cellar. At the time, they dismissed it as the settling of beams or the scurry of animals. Elias himself would glance toward the hearth as if to acknowledge the noise, then return to eating with perfect calm. None of the children reacted. They sat with folded hands until dismissed, their faces expressionless, their silence too exact to be natural. Looking back, those who had dined there realized that every gesture in that house had been orchestrated. The portions, the silence, the rhythm of chewing, even the stillness of children during strange noises from below. The meals were not mere hospitality, they were performances of order, rehearsals in obedience. Guests thought they were being welcomed. In truth, they had been invited to witness Elias's doctrine acted out in the flesh of his family. And when neighbors later spoke of those dinners, they admitted to a guilt that pressed years after. They had seen children trained into silence. They had heard sounds no meal should carry, and they had brushed it away because Elias Morton smiled, and because the food was good. The truth of Elias Morton's cruelty did not come all at once. It surfaced slowly through fragments of memory, scraps of writing, and the grisly evidence unearthed long after the house had collapsed. At first, it seemed that his punishments were harsh but random, the actions of a strict father in a brutal age. But the more survivors whispered and the more journals were read, the clearer it became that nothing Elias did was impulsive. There was method in everything, each torment bound to a lesson, each injury tied to a symbol only he seemed to understand. His cruelty was not chaos. It was ritual. Neighbors recalled odd remarks the children made, words that made little sense at the time. Samuel once muttered that his teeth hurt because his father wanted them sharp. Only later did it become known that Elias had filed his children's teeth into points, grinding enamel away while telling them that strong teeth meant strong souls. Another child's palms bore scars shaped like grains, remnants of a punishment where Elias forced their hands into boiling corn meant for feed, insisting patience was learned when flesh endured heat without flinch. These were not accidents or bursts of anger. They were structured lessons, twisted versions of virtues made physical through pain. When remains were discovered decades later in shallow earth near the old farm, the markings confirmed the stories. Bone fragments bore grooves too precise to be chance. Skulls showed teeth worn down into unnatural sharpness. On ribs and arms, faint carvings were found, etched symbols cut into the very skin before death. Elias had called them verses in his journal, passages written not on paper but on bodies. He believed obedience needed to be marked where it could not be erased. His pen had not been enough. His knife had become the scripture. The chilling part was how ordinary it looked on the surface. To outsiders, the Morton children were simply well-behaved, polite, never raising their voices. To Elias, they were vessels for his theology of control, flesh molded into scripture that he alone could read. What others mistook for discipline was, in truth, rehearsal for rituals that left scars both visible and hidden. Each torment carried a pattern, a rhythm, a deliberate mark. It was not punishment for misbehavior. It was instruction toward a distorted vision of perfection. Looking back, neighbors confessed that they had admired the family's order. They had seen the silence at the table, the bowed heads, the children's unwavering posture. And they thought it was virtue. They had mistaken ritual for piety, cruelty for discipline. When the evidence emerged years later, when bones and journals told what no living child remained to say, it became clear that Elias Morton had not merely abused his family. He had crafted them into instruments, carving his doctrine into their very bodies. The horror was not in a sudden outburst of violence, but in the steady, measured hand of a father who smiled while turning lessons into scripture. It was madness, yes, but it was madness with method, and that made it all the more terrifying. The memory came from a farmer's wife who lived 2 miles down the road, a woman who often lent a hand to the Morton household when Clara's mother fell ill. She remembered one summer afternoon when Clara asked her to help with the butter churn. The girl carried the pail with both hands, her small frame straining under the weight, her red ribbon slipping down over her shoulder. They set to work in the dim kitchen, the air warm with the smell of curd and salt. At first the task felt ordinary, the familiar rhythm of churning that every farm wife knew by heart. But when the woman lifted the lid to check the progress, what met her eyes was wrong. The milk was no longer white and clean. It was streaked with dark veins, a tar-like blackness swirling through it, thicker than cream, heavier than it should have been. The smell clung sour in her throat. Clara only stared into the churn and whispered almost too softly to hear that this was how her father taught them, to watch what was pure become strong by suffering. The woman tried to laugh it away, telling herself the milk had spoiled, that the churn had not been washed, but the sight stayed with her. Weeks later, her own cow fell sick. The animal stopped eating, its belly swelling until it collapsed in the stall. When the men opened the carcass, they found its stomach filled with stones, smooth, round, packed tight as if placed there by hand. No one could explain it. Some said the animal had swallowed gravel from the pasture, but the farmer's wife swore the stones were too large, too many, too deliberate. She thought of Clara's whisper again, her voice flat as she said, "That's how Papa teaches bodies to harden." Stories of Elias's strange lessons multiplied in hushed retellings. Milk turned black in the churn, animals found with stomachs ruined, children forced to drink broth until they gagged and were made to swallow more. He spoke of the body as something that must be shaped like iron, bent until it did not break. What seemed superstition at first began to feel like ritual, a quiet order of cruelty disguised as teaching. Neighbors who once admired the Mortons began to feel uneasy, though none dared speak openly. Elias's calm presence disarmed suspicion. He was seen in church, head bowed, eyes closed, hands folded. The family smiled faintly beside him, silent as stone. Clara's ribbon appeared again in memory, bright against her hair, when the farmer's wife thought back to that churn of blackened milk. The image of the girl standing so still, her hands clasped, watching without fear as corruption swirled in what should have been clean, haunted the woman for years. It was not the milk itself that chilled her, nor the stones in her cow's belly. It was the way Clara seemed to accept it all as lesson, the way she carried her father's doctrine even into the simplest chore. Evil had seeped into the rhythm of farm life, into butter, into cattle, into the very act of eating. What should have nourished became a warning, though no one heeded it in time. And when the house later stood empty with meals left warm on the table, the memory of that churn sat heavy in the woman's mind. She realized Elias had been feeding not only his family but the land itself, a doctrine that turned even milk black and taught children to believe that pain was proof of strength. Samuel Keaton was not a Morton by blood but by misfortune. He was a distant cousin, 11 years old, sent to live with Elias's family after fever claimed his parents. At first, the neighbors thought the arrangement fortunate. The Mortons had land, stability, a house that seemed respectable. Samuel arrived thin, but with the wary look of a child used to hardship. Within weeks, that wariness deepened into fear. He was seen once at the edge of a neighbor's field, barefoot, his shirt collar torn, begging for shelter. The farmer's wife recalled the tremor in his voice when he said he couldn't go back. He spoke of the lessons Elias forced upon him, words that came out in fragments as if he had practiced them in whispers but never dared finish aloud. What Samuel revealed was grotesque in its detail. He told of nails pried from his fingers when he hesitated at chores, Elias saying that defiance must be unrooted like weeds. He described his eyes held open with rough splints while a candle flame wavered inches away, the heat searing until tears streamed down and blurred the light. He spoke of being locked in the cellar, forced to kneel in marked circles scratched into the earth, each minute timed, each tremor noted. These were not punishments born of anger. They were rituals, rehearsed and deliberate. The boy's words carried the exhaustion of someone catalogued like a specimen, studied rather than scolded. The farmer wanted to believe the child had exaggerated, that grief and fear had colored his stories. Elias Morton was a man of discipline, yes, but also a man of God, admired by many. The boy's plea was met with uneasy comfort and a promise that things would improve. Samuel was sent back, his protests softened by the authority of adults unwilling to question Elias's smile. Days later, he was gone. No one recalled seeing him leave the farm. No notice was given. The family simply said he had wandered. His name was never spoken in church again. Years afterward, when the farm lay abandoned, boys exploring the barn rafters found something small wedged between the beams. It was a tooth, brittle with age, its roots still stained dark. The neighbors said it must have been Samuel's. They remembered the way he had begged, the way his voice cracked when he spoke of lessons no child should know. The discovery confirmed what they had ignored, that his words had been truth, not invention. Elias had added him to the ledger of discipline, folded him into the same doctrine of flesh and silence that had consumed his own children. The tooth, small and white against the wood, became the only relic of Samuel Keaton's short life on the Morton farm. It was not a grave, not a marker, but a fragment of proof lodged in a place where no one had thought to look. The neighbors who once dismissed his cries could not escape the weight of it. They had heard his warning and chosen to believe in Elias's order instead. By the time the rafters gave up their secret, it was too late to reckon with the choice. Samuel's fate was sealed not only by Elias's hand, but by the silence of those who turned him away. In the end, his lessons had not been written in journals but in pain, and the only evidence left was a tooth, clinging to wood long after the boy himself had vanished into the earth. By the turn of the new century, the Morton farm was little more than a husk, its timbers sagging and fields gone wild. In 1901, a crew was sent to clear the ground for new planting, and when their shovels struck the stones of the old root cellar, they decided to pull them free. The cellar was dark, musty, its air heavy with the smell of long-sealed earth. At first, the men found nothing but collapsed beams and shards of broken crockery. But as one wall was pried loose, a hollow space revealed itself, lined with stones that did not match the rest. Behind the falsework sat a row of glass jars, sealed tight with wax. They had been placed carefully, each jar spaced evenly, each resting on a flat shelf of packed earth. The men lifted the first jar into the light and recoiled. Inside floated something pale, curled upon itself, suspended in brine that had grown cloudy with age. It was no vegetable, no stored root. It was a heart, small, unmistakably human, the size of a child's fist. Another jar revealed the same, each organ preserved in liquid, each holding its shape with grotesque clarity even after decades underground. What froze the men most were the labels. Scraps of parchment had been pressed against the glass, the ink still legible in the damp. Initials were written there, CM, SM, RM, EM, Jr., the names of the Morton children reduced to letters preserved like specimens. The workers laid the jars out in the daylight, their hands trembling as they counted. Each jar corresponded to a name neighbors remembered, each heart a testament that the children had not wandered or fled, but had been taken apart and hidden. The cellar had not merely stored food, it had stored trophies. Elias Morton's journals had hinted at marking obedience in flesh. But here was the physical archive of that doctrine, sealed in glass, protected with care as if meant to endure long beyond the man himself. The discovery spread through the county with a kind of hushed terror. Families who had once dined at the Morton table, who had praised the silence of his children, now realized that beneath their feet, in the earth that held the foundation of that home, Elias had built a shrine to his cruelty. The hearts were not buried in shame. They were arranged, preserved, displayed in a secret gallery where only he would kneel to look upon them. To him, obedience had not ended with death. It had been bottled, kept, catalogued, proof of lessons complete. The jars were collected by authorities, though no trial could follow. Elias Morton was long gone, the farm a ruin, the graves unmarked. The relics were buried quietly in consecrated ground, but the shock of the find lingered. Farmers swore the earth at the old Morton property never yielded crops again, as though the soil itself rejected growth after holding such things. For neighbors who still remembered the family, the cellar became a symbol not of storage but of concealment, of how evil can seal itself away in plain sight, waiting for time to pry it loose. The hearts, floating in silence behind false stone, were the final record of the Morton children's obedience. Each one marked not just a life lost, but a life transformed into an artifact. The cellar had not stayed empty. It had kept its secret intact until the day men with shovels broke the seal. And when the jars were carried out into the sun, the light revealed not only what Elias had done, but what a community had failed to see. That the family who vanished from supper had not disappeared into mystery, but into glass, preserved beneath their own kitchen floor, waiting for a future generation to discover what silence can hide. The night the Mortons vanished was remembered first for its ordinary stillness. A neighbor returning from the river recalled passing the farm and seeing a warm lamplight through the window. The glow framed the table inside where shapes sat in their usual places. He thought little of it. Supper was common at that hour. He remembered only the faint clink of cutlery carried through the evening air, the way shadows moved in unison as if the family bent their heads together in prayer. Yet when he glanced back minutes later, the lamplight was gone. Darkness pressed against the glass. No figure stirred. The house seemed to have folded in on itself, silent, sealed. He assumed the lamp had been blown out for the night and carried on, never imagining that he had witnessed the last moments anyone would see the Mortons alive. When Union scouts arrived days later, sent to scour the area for food supplies, they stepped into a scene that felt staged, frozen mid-breath. The table was set with bowls of stew, each still holding a thin skin where the broth had cooled. A loaf of cornbread sliced into perfect squares sat untouched in the center. 5 tin cups lined the table, each still warm to the touch as if the family had risen only moments before. Chairs were pulled back but not pushed away, each angled just enough to suggest haste, as though every person had stood in unison and moved from the table at the same time. No scraps lay on the floor. No dishes were overturned. It was not chaos, not flight, but something more controlled, as if supper had been interrupted by command. The room itself carried an unease. The clock on the mantel ticked, but its hands were frozen at 12. The hearth embers glowed faintly, though no wood had been added in hours. A ribbon lay folded on the dresser, corners squared beside a slate where names had been scrawled and crossed away. Nothing suggested intrusion. The door was unbroken, windows latched, the animals outside calm. Yet the food had been left behind, the meal unfinished, the order of the table still precise. It was as though the Mortons had risen mid-prayer, mid-breath, and walked silently out of the house, leaving supper waiting for no one. Neighbors who later entered the house admitted the air felt wrong. They spoke of a heaviness, as if someone had been watching them from the corners of the room. Some said the spoons all pointed east, the knives aligned in one direction, a detail that chilled them when they realized such arrangements were not accident, but practice. The cellar beneath groaned with a hollow stillness, and though no one found bodies, the air smelled faintly metallic, like iron and stone. No tracks led away from the house, no horses were missing. It was as if the family had stepped into the air itself and vanished. The image of that table haunted the community for years. People recalled the meal intact and waiting long after the house itself rotted. They spoke of it as a symbol of interruption, of lives stopped mid-motion, of lessons that ended without conclusion. Some whispered that Elias had orchestrated it himself, that the final act of obedience was not in life, but in disappearance, the family trained to rise in silence and leave the table behind as testimony. Others said the devil had come for them, that the lamplight extinguished in an instant was not chance, but summons. Whatever the truth, the sight of warm bowls and chairs pulled back remained fixed in memory. It was not only the food that unsettled, but the order. The fact that nothing was broken, nothing scattered, nothing desperate. The Mortons had not fled. They had not fought. They had obeyed something unseen, stood together, and walked away. And when the scouts reported what they found, their words carried the weight of something more than a disappearance. They had stepped into a room that still felt occupied, into a supper paused mid-bite. The Mortons were gone. Yet the house still waited, the table still set, the meal still warm. It was as though silence itself had sat down to eat, and the family had risen to follow it into the dark. By 1870, the Morton farm was no longer spoken of in open company, though its shadow stretched across the county like a scar. The house itself leaned inward, its timbers soft with rot, windows broken, roof sagging beneath the weight of years. Grass rose through the floorboards, vines claimed the porch, and yet travelers swore the place never felt empty. They said the silence there was thicker than wind, that it pressed against the ears like cloth. The family was gone, written off as vanished without explanation. But their absence stirred unease strong enough that the state could not ignore it. That year, without fanfare, Florida passed a quiet law requiring every farmstead to report household censuses in detail, with particular attention to children. Each year, names and ages were to be listed and signed by a local clerk. At first glance, the statute seemed bureaucratic, a small matter of order during a time of national upheaval. But those who lived near the abandoned Morton farm understood what had driven it. Historians later traced the language of the law back to the whispers that spread after Union scouts described what they found inside the house. Meals still on the table, chairs drawn back, no sign of flight. The rumors only deepened when neighbors recalled bruises on children's necks, the strange silences during suppers, the thuds beneath the floor. Everyone suspected, yet no one spoke while Elias Morton lived. And when the family disappeared, the truth sank with them. There was no trial, no named suspect, no body to bury. The state, unwilling to confront what could not be proved, chose instead to legislate against its repetition. If children could vanish within the walls of a home without a trace, then at least their absence would be noted in ink. The law marked a turning point, though few at the time recognized its origin. Clerks began visiting farms once a year, counting heads, writing names. Some parents bristled, calling it intrusion, but most complied. Beneath the surface, everyone understood that it was easier to mark a child on paper than to admit how easily a child could disappear in silence. The Mortons were never mentioned by name in official debate. Their story had become something poisonous, an open secret that could not be acknowledged directly. Yet the timing was too sharp, the language too precise to be coincidence. Florida was building a paper wall where no one had dared build a moral one. Still, the law could not mend what had already rotted. The Morton house was left to collapse, stone by stone, beam by beam. No family ever claimed it. No auction was held. It became a place children dared each other to approach and adults crossed the road to avoid. In town, when their name arose, it was dismissed with a shake of the head. Gone. That single word carried finality, but also a weight of complicity. To call them gone was easier than to say what everyone feared, that they had been erased by the hand of the man who smiled among them. In the decades that followed, the census law hardened into routine. Farmers listed names, clerks checked ledgers, children's existence confirmed in ink. On paper, it looked like progress, but in the silence beneath it, the memory of the Morton family remained unresolved. They had been written out not only of the census, but of history. Reduced to rumor, their house left as warning rather than home. The law stood as proof that the state had noticed something monstrous had happened, even if it lacked the courage to name it. And so the Mortons were remembered not by justice, not by graves, but by a statute scribbled into law, a paper echo of children once marked in flesh, now preserved only as names no one dared speak aloud. By the 1920s, the Morton farm had finally been reduced to rubble. The sagging house, left to weather and rot for half a century, was torn down by men who claimed the ground would be better served for new planting. They hauled away the timbers, stacked the stones, and filled the cellar with earth. Yet when the last of it was cleared, the workers whispered that the land itself seemed unwilling to heal. The soil where crops once grew stayed barren, hard-packed, refusing to take seed. Even weeds struggled to push through. Neighbors shook their heads and said the ground remembered. They spoke of a chill that clung to the air above the ruins, colder than the surrounding fields even on summer nights. A silence that pressed down heavier than heat. Children in the nearby town turned the place into a test of courage. They dared one another to creep toward the cellar, to stand at its edge where the earth had been filled in, but still sagged like a scar. Some swore they felt the ground vibrate beneath their feet, as if something stirred far below. Others claimed they heard faint sounds rising from the soil, a thin, trembling note like a voice half singing and half breathing, cut short before it could finish. The older children laughed at the tales, yet even they avoided the ruins at dusk. They said the silence there felt too deep, as if it listened back. Adults dismissed the stories, but few willingly worked the field. Attempts to grow corn or beans failed year after year. Animals balked near the site, refusing to graze. Hunters noted that deer skirted wide circles around the old property. The ruin had become less a memory than a boundary, a patch of earth that the living instinctively avoided. And still the cellar remained the heart of it, a hollow space long buried yet never gone, a place that seemed to breathe when one stood too close. Some of the older neighbors, those who had been children when the Mortons vanished, admitted in hushed voices that they too heard things when they passed. One recalled stopping near the site at twilight and catching the faint echo of humming, steady as the kind Elias once demanded before meals. Another said she heard a child's voice holding a note, quivering as though forced to continue beyond endurance. Whether real or imagined, the sounds tied the present to the past, carrying the doctrine of silence that Elias had etched into his family long after their bodies were gone. The land was never sold. Families that moved to the county learned quickly which fields to work and which to leave alone. The ruin of the Morton farm became a warning, a reminder passed down in whispers. By daylight it was only dirt and stone, but in memory it was still a supper table, a cellar lined with hooks, a ribbon nailed to a tree. In every failed crop and every child who swore they heard singing, the silence remained, echoing long after the house itself had been cleared away. It was proof that some lessons outlast their maker, and that the ground can keep secrets even when men try to bury them. The last pages of Elias Morton's journals survive in fragments, their ink browned, the paper brittle from years in damp soil. They carry no confessions, no pleas for forgiveness, only instructions written with the same neat hand that had recorded every lesson before. He wrote of silence as if it were a substance to be mined, shaped, and carried. He wrote of obedience as if it had to be carved into flesh so that the soul could not forget. The body remembers longer than the spirit, he scrawled across one margin. Mark it well. These words, preserved by chance, revealed not a sudden descent into madness, but a steady devotion to cruelty disguised as order. Elias did not rage in these pages. He reasoned, he measured, he believed. Looking back, it is clear that the evil in the Morton household did not wear horns or shadows. It wore civility. It bowed its head in church, smiled across supper tables, and offered help to neighbors in need. Elias appeared as a man of discipline, a man whose children were well behaved and whose home was always in order. But beneath that calm exterior, every gesture concealed a darker purpose. The meals with rigid silence, the cellar with its hooks, the journals with their tallies. All of it showed how evil could grow not in the wilderness, not in the chaos of war, but in the smallest routines of daily life. It hid in plain sight, using normalcy as its shield. The legacy of the Mortons lingered long after the house crumbled. Laws were passed to account for children, soil refused to grow where their farm once stood, and stories of singing beneath the earth haunted generations. Yet no trial was held, no justice named. The family simply disappeared, leaving behind the chilling certainty that cruelty had lived among them for years, unchallenged, unnoticed, allowed to thrive because it looked so much like discipline. The neighbors who once praised Elias's calm now admitted that his smile had concealed something they did not wish to see. Their silence, too, had allowed his doctrine to take root. What remains now is not only the horror of what was done, but the warning it carries. If civility can cloak cruelty so easily, if obedience can be mistaken for virtue, then how would we recognize such evil in our own time? Would we notice when suffering hides behind discipline, when harm is excused as order, when silence is praised as good behavior? Or would we smile back, grateful for the calm, and turn away? The story of the Morton family is less about their disappearance than about what it reveals. That evil does not need the cover of night or the chaos of battle. It can live at a supper table in prayer in the everyday acts we admire. The journals close without remorse, their words steady to the last. And so the final question lingers, pressing as heavily now as it did then. What do you think? Could this happen again?